fall, and then cold fall, and then spring.
Happy World Lemur every day. Happy World Lemur Day, everybody.
And educator Megan McGrath, how are you guys doing?
Doing real well.
We are very excited to learn about lemurs today. We had a little bit of pre-show discussion about how cool lemurs are and how much better they are than some other animals. They are so great.
It's always important to have a ranking.
Megan, prior to the show going on, you mentioned that there's a particular Korean phrase for lemurs that was particularly appropriate. What was that again?
Yeah, so a family came for a tour once and asked them how to say it in Korean, and the word for lemur is literally translated to fox monkey, which I found super appropriate for where lemurs fall in the ranking of primates.
Okay, one moment. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay, I had audio issues earlier this morning, so sorry. I'm trying to fix them as we go along.
Gabe does a lot of things behind the scenes, guys. So, Megan and Matt, could you both give us some information about your background and what you both do now at the Duke Lemur Center?
Sure. Megan, if you want to go first, since you work with the living lemurs.
Sure. Absolutely. So my name is Megan McGrath, and I'm the Education Programs Manager here at the Duke Lemur Center, where I is here. And I, as Matt was phrasing it, work with the living lemurs, not the fossil collection. So the unique thing about the Duke Lemur Center is we kind of span all of it. We have programs going on here on site with over 200 lemurs that live here in North Carolina. We do conservation programs in Madagascar, and of course, Matt's going to talk all about our fossil collection. So my role is kind of bringing all of those things together and educating the public, educating tour visitors and school groups. And my background actually goes all over the place. I've been an animal keeper. I've worked in libraries and restaurants, and I thought I was going to be a psychologist at one point in my life. So I've had a lot of varied experience, and turns out I just really like talking to people about animals.
Good life
relatable.
Choice.
Yeah.
Very relatable.
And my name is Matt, and I'm a paleontologist, and that means I study fossils. And in the case of the Lemur Center, it means that I focus a lot of my energy on studying the fossil record of primates. And in my presentation, I'll talk about what that means. But the way I became a paleontologist was I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Cincinnati, Ohio basically sits on like miles of fossils. It's just like a coral reef from the Ordovician, so a long, long time ago. And so I grew up collecting fossils and really excited about ancient animals and ancient time. But then as I got older, I kind of assumed everyone had found everything and that all of the science that you could be doing on fossils was done. And as everyone who watches this program knows, that's not true. But I didn't know that until I got to college. Where I discovered geology as a field, and actually went into geology because I was interested in basically how the Earth kind of got put together the way that it does. I was also interested in history. I was interested in medicine. I was always interested in animals. And especially geology became this way to look at history going way, 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 way back. And there, one of my classes was taught by a paleontologist. And it's like, this guy is doing something. There must be something to discover still. And so I ended up working in a lab there and kind of worked my way into studying especially the mammal fossil record. So I did geology and anthropology were my majors in undergrad. Anthropology is the study of kind of humans and primates writ large, but I focused on kind of primate evolution and human evolution. And then I went to graduate school to keep studying fossils, to kind of become someone who could go off and look for these things with some grant support behind me, and ultimately was interested in working with museums. And so I'm really interested in kind of using fossils to talk about lots of different parts of science. And that museums, as you both know, are a great place to do that. And so the Lemur Center is a really spectacular place because it has a fossil collection that we're working on building into a museum space we can actually bring people into. And it also has the living collection with it. So we're basically like a zoo combined with a natural history museum. And I'm a little bit of a paleontologist who had an existential crisis because there's a lot of extinction going on right now. And I was studying extinctions that were very, very old. And as I'll talk about in my presentation, there's a real connection between especially the fossil record of Madagascar and extinctions that are going on right now, and the pressures on the really endangered species that are lemurs. And so the Lemur Center is also a really great place where I can feel like I'm kind of contributing to more contemporary questions than some of the research that I do on things tens of millions of years ago.
Awesome. Well,
I'm
thank
very
you
jealous.
guys. Yeah, that is such a cool center and such cool work.
Well, I miss
go ahead,
working with
Gabe.
I was gonna say I just miss working with like live squishy animals sometimes. It's
That's
cool
true.
working with fossils.
Yeah.
I love them, but sometimes I want to see the life behind their eyes sometimes.
Alrighty, everyone. If you have any questions for our guest today, as always, go ahead and put those in the live chat. We will have a Q&A session afterwards. And Matt and Megan, whenever you're ready, go on and take it away.
So I'm going to be leading the first part of our talk today, which is basically a presentation on the fossil record of lemurs. Like, where do these animals come from and what are they in the first place? And so I have a presentation that... Does that look good, Megan? Okay. So today, like we said, is World Lemur Day. And it's celebration both in Madagascar and here at the Lemur Center and all around the world for these amazing creatures. And of course, we're celebrating lemurs all the time at the Duke Lemur Center. And so the way I've kind of summarized what I want to focus on is the epic journey of leaping lemurs and kind of getting into how these animals ended up ultimately on the island of Madagascar, where we find over 100 species of lemurs today. And like I said, I'm talking to you from the Duke Lemur Center, where we're kind of split between this natural history collection and a living collection. The Duke Lemur Center is kind of a weird thing to explain, like why does it exist? And the reason it does is ultimately to better understand the biology of lemurs. And the reason you want to do that is because lemurs have really important information to share with us about basically what it means to be a primate. A primate is the group of animals that we belong to along with lemurs. And so there's a lot of research that takes place. All of it is non-invasive. That means we kind of let the animals lead the research. Some of them are trained to do behaviors, things like touch colors on screens. But all of the research is basically observing them. We've had 39 different species of lemur that have lived at the Duke Lemur Center. And we also are part of the larger breeding network for these animals to help these really endangered species kind of survive both in captivity and ultimately in the wild. And there's a lot of people involved in the Duke Lemur Center. But this is a video that shows the coolest thing about the Lemur Center, which is unlike a traditional zoo where we would have them in kind of smaller enclosures, the animals are actually free ranging. There's about 100 acres here at Duke University that is allocated for the Duke Lemur Center, where all these different species are allowed to basically wander through the forests of North Carolina, where they can have their most like natural behavior. So we have things like this shafak, that's actually able to kind of like munch on leaves the way that it would if it was living in Madagascar. And by letting them live in these larger groups in open enclosures, they can behave in ways that look a lot more like how they behave in Madagascar, like that amazing leaping that we see from the shafaks. And so I work in a place that is less open. This is the fossil collection at the Duke Lemur Center, where we have right now over 35,000 specimens. So it's a relatively small collection, but that's because it's really focused. Ultimately, what we're trying to do through the fossil collection is connect lemurs to humans so that all the research that we're doing and what we're discovering about lemur biology ultimately can be connected to our own biology. And so what we try to do is then follow primates, the group that unites lemurs and humans all around the world, because they've really had an incredible journey. And that takes us to fossil collecting in Madagascar. It takes us to Egypt, Colombia, which is in South America, and we do fossil collecting actually here in the United States, because believe it or not, some of the primate story actually intersects with this continent. And so before I get even more into it, there's a couple of questions I want to answer. First of all, what is a primate, especially what is a primate to a paleontologist? If you go out and observe primates like these animals on this slide, you're most likely to find them in forested environments. A lot of them you're going to find in trees. You're going to notice that they're pretty smart animals that live in complicated social environments, but that's not something we can observe very well in the fossil record. We don't actually find the animals kind of clinging to trees, although that would be an amazing thing if we found that in the fossil record. And so we need to find other ways we can understand what a primate is if we're going to study them in the fossil record. Then I want to get at what is a lemur specifically within this larger group of primates. And then finally, why is a squirrel not a primate? Because squirrels are mammals, they have fur, they climb in trees, they can have some social behaviors with each other as they yell about who gets that slice of pizza that was left at the park. And all of that is stuff that the fossil record can ultimately tell us about. So this is the skull of a ruffed lemur, which is a lemur that lives at the Lemur Center, and they look like they have these big beards underneath their chins, compared to the skull of a squirrel. And when you look at the skull of these two animals, there's a key difference that paleontologists focus on, and it's right here on the side of the skull. In a lemur, you find this bone that connects basically the top of the skull to the cheekbone. In a squirrel, in most other mammals, you have this opening between the top of the skull and the cheekbone. It's not this bar of bone. And so one of the things that makes a primate is the presence of this bar of bone. And you can actually feel that bar on yourself. If you very gently kind of roll your finger along the side of your eye, you can feel you have that hard bone that goes all the way around your eye socket. That's one of the clues that tells us that you're a primate just like this lemur. Other key features that we find in the fossil record are if we find the hands of these animals. And so one of the things that is a key primate trait is the presence of an opposable thumb. And so a thumb that sticks out that you can actually use to kind of rotate and touch some of your other fingers to grab onto stuff is something that is kind of a special superpower of primates. A squirrel doesn't have that. This arrow is pointing at kind of this stumpy little thumb thing, like the fifth digit of the squirrel is really, really small. And isn't really big enough for them to like rotate around and grab onto stuff. It's like squirrels kind of grip it with their claws. And those claws are a really important feature that separates primates from other mammals. Claws are found on most other creatures, but if you look at the end of the fingers of a lemur or the end of the fingers of a human, of course you find fingernails. And the presence of fingernails are actually something that we can observe in the fossil record because the bone that is like making the end of our fingers is kind of squashed flat, which becomes kind of the model for this like larger, basically flattened claw, which is what our fingernails are. And so the presence of kind of squashed fingers with big fingernails is something that tells us we're dealing with a primate. And then finally, within primates, lemurs have some specialized anatomy that tells us when we're dealing with a lemur and not another kind of primate, that we're not dealing with an ape or a monkey. One of those traits is something called the tooth comb. And the tooth comb is basically like a whole bunch of teeth in the front of the jaw that have smushed together. All the incisors and the canine are kind of together as this structure that comes by its name really honestly. It's basically used for like grooming their fur, for fluffing their fur and other stuff like that. And other primates don't have this tooth comb. As you can tell, every time you smile, you don't have a comb sticking out the front of your face. So you are not a lemur, but you are a primate because you have things like fingernails, thumb, and this bone around your eye. Another key trait that lemurs have is they do have one claw, and it's on their foot, and it's called the grooming claw. And so one of their fingernails has basically been remodified back into a claw that they use for kind of scratching, and they use it for also picking at their fur. And it's a feature that if we find a lemur in the fossil record, we expect to find a tooth comb in the mouth, and we expect to find a grooming claw on the foot. So that's kind of When we're looking for primates, when we're looking for lemurs, those are the things we can actually find in the fossil record because they're connected to bone. Now, if we want to find the bones of these animals, we have to go back in time to figure out where we can discover these things. And there's all of the geological record to work with. We know from the fossil record of primates and lemurs that the time we really want to focus on is the age of mammals, or the Cenozoic era. And so the Cenozoic starts about 66 million years ago. And it is the end of the age of dinosaurs, or at least the end of the age of non-avian dinosaurs. And it allows all of these mammal groups to kind of diversify. And so the first true primates are found very soon after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so when we start to piece together the family tree of primates, we have lemurs that branch off very soon after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And then we have all these other lineages that diversify, and eventually we get a group of animals called apes, and that is the group that we belong to. And so between lemurs and apes is all this other diversity. And so when we go to the fossil record, if we want to figure out kind of where lemurs came from, where monkeys came from, where apes came from, we can kind of target each of these branches in the family tree. And each of those branches lines up with a specific time period. There was a time when there was a common ancestor of old world monkeys and apes, a time when there was an ancestor for all monkeys, and a time when there's an ancestor of all primates. Each of those goes further and further back in time. So we can actually go into the rock record and target specific time periods to try to find the bones of these ancient animals, including the origins of lemurs. Now, paleontologists have been looking for the origins of lemurs and other primates for a long time, and some of the oldest relatives of primates are found about 60 million years ago during the Paleocene. That says Eocene at the top, and that is incorrect. And the Paleocene is the chunk of time right after the extinction of the dinosaurs. When we go looking for these primate-like animals in the fossil record during this time, we don't really find them in the places you would expect. Today, we think of lemurs as living in Madagascar, which is a relatively tropical place. We think of monkeys living in Africa, in South America, and parts of Southeast Asia. We don't think of them as being in the northern continents, but the fossil record tells us that is where primates got their start, was in places like North America, Europe, and Asia. And so, as we go a little bit sooner in time, so we go from primate-like things to finally true primates that emerge about 55 million years ago. And these animals are, again, spread across the northern continent. So primates are this northern group that we find not in Africa, not in South America, but in places like Europe, Asia, and North America. At that point, we have a big split that happens within primates. We have one group of animals that is going to go on to become the lemur line, and that is the group that we call Adapiforms. That's this animal on the left represented by Neotharctus. That's kind of jumping the way that we would expect a shafak to do if you went out to the forests of the Duke Lemur Center. On the other side, we have the Omomyids, and the Omomyids are these little kind of, they're really small kind of tarsier-like animals. Tarsiers are a type of primate that have really big eyes. They live in Southeast Asia, and they are really cute or really creepy, depending on how you feel about giant eyes. But these Omomyids are ultimately, we think, the common relatives of things like monkeys and apes. And so very, very early in the primate story, we have this split between lemurs going one way and monkeys and ape relatives going the other. Now, if we want to figure out kind of how these animals were first diversifying and where they came from, we go to a geological map to try to find rocks that are from about 55 million years ago that likely preserve these very earliest primates that we find around the world. And so this is a geological map of North America. And this green stuff that's kind of all through the middle, that is kind of age of dinosaur rock that we find. And then in the middle of that, you can see some orange and some yellow. Those are rocks from the beginning of the age of mammals. And so we go to those rocks to try to find some of these early primate-like animals that came soon after the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, one of the questions is why we go to the American West to look for these things. We find fossils of primates. They lived, as far as we can tell, all over North America, all over Europe and Asia, but there's only certain sites where we can actually find these things. And in our case, it's basically the Rocky Mountain West is one of the best places really in the world to try to find these early lemur-like primates and try to figure out where lemur story really begins. And the reason why we find them in the Rocky Mountain West is a little bit of geology. So this is basically what's going on in the western part of North America near the age of dinosaurs, where the Rocky Mountains are being pushed up as continents are colliding with each other. The Rocky Mountains then, as they're erupting, are pushing up bubbles of other rock and lifting up basically the base of North America to kind of raise a whole bunch of mountains up in the air. Those mountains start to break down because erosion is the process where wind and water takes rock that's basically sticking out and slowly breaks it down. That rock getting broken down by water flows down the side of these mountains and hills and goes out to become streams and creeks and eventually go into big rivers that create giant flood systems that create basically like floodplains that are a great place for things like trees to grow, where eventually primates are going to like hanging out. When those primates die, unfortunately, on that floodplain, they get deposited in all this new rock that's being laid down by the eroding Rocky Mountains. Later, we get some uplift that pushes some of that flood rock or sandstone back up above the surface. That gets cut by water again, and that is where we go fossil hunting. And so a lot of fossil hunting for these early primates is in places like Wyoming, which is in the western part of North America, in places like the Bighorn Basin and the Bridger Basin. This is a geological map of Wyoming, and these basins are there are fossils that have been collected by researchers all over the world from these places, because these are kind of the best sites to find early lemur-like primates from really anywhere in the world. This is what that world would have looked like 55 million years ago. This time period is a very lush, very warm time. It's actually, we think, the warmest the Earth has ever been since the extinction of the dinosaurs. And that warming happened really quickly. So there's a lot of research that goes on in the rocks that contain these primate fossils, partially to better understand what the future of the planet looks like if global warming trends continue the way that they are right now. And we know from the fossil record that there were things like basically dense forests in Wyoming and all the way into parts of southern Canada, where primates were living. Today, they aren't as fuzzy. They look a little bit more like this. And so this is some of the fossils that we've collected from the western part of North America. So I'm going to share some video of what that fossil hunting actually looks like out in Wyoming. So we travel from North Carolina, which is where the Duke Lemur Center is, out to the American West. And this is kind of the classic scene of going fossil hunting, where we go into the Badlands. And all of those layers of rock that you can see in this image, different colors, are basically different flooding events and different layers of rock being laid down as those rivers and streams coming off what were the Rocky Mountains that were bigger and have kind of eroded since then, were contributing to this giant basin that filled up with lots of sand, lots of mud, and lots of fossils. And so we can walk out across this landscape and find evidence of these very ancient forest systems. And so this is me kind of pointing at the mountains. These are the Uinta Mountains that have eroded and filled in this basin. So you can kind of like point at the source for a lot of the rock that we're standing on. And this is a close-up of what one of these kind of floodplains looks like, where we find these early relatives of lemurs and their relatives. And so this, it's really exciting fossil hunting because you basically find stuff just sitting on the surface. Thunderstorms and snowstorms kind of rapidly erode the surface of this mudstone and sandstone. So this is the jaw of a very large kind of gopher-sized rodent that would have been found alongside a primate. These are colleagues from Duke, Doug Boyer and Madison Bradley, who are out looking for fossils with me, along with Alex, who's a fossil hunter from Seattle, who is an expert at finding primates from this time period. And so we identified a fossil of a primate. This is the side of the brain case, basically, of one of these lemur-like primates that was discovered in the rocks of Wyoming. This animal is about 50 million years old. And Doug here is kind of trying to figure out if we have more of it. And we do. We actually discovered there were pieces of tail and pieces of arm bone that were sticking out that suggested we had the entire skeleton of this early lemur animal called Smilodectes preserved in the rock. And so, of course, then we have to get it out. And so one of the things that you've probably seen many images of is paleontologists lifting out blocks of rock around fossils. And part of the reason for that is for 50 million years, this rock has kept this fossil very, very stable. And so we want to take that rock and use it to our advantage to kind of keep that rock safe as we transport it back to a lab where we can more carefully remove all of the rock and stabilize the fossil as it comes out of the ground. And so eventually it came back here to Duke as this big block of rock and was prepared by our preparator, Carrie Whitman, who is an expert at working with the remains of these animals. And so I'll show you some of the fossil of that animal that we ultimately stop sharing my screen. And so this is that skull that we found of Smilodectes. That name is right here. And so Smilodectes, we ended up discovering this complete skull. This is where the brain case would be. We know it's a primate, partially because one of the things that makes a primate is a relatively large brain. And you can see this bar of bone that is between the top of the skull and the cheekbone that tells us we're dealing with a primate. And so along with this skull of Smilodectes that we discovered in 2019, we also found some other parts of its skeleton, including in that block, parts of its arm bone right here. And so by looking at the arm of this creature, we can compare it to things like lemurs here at the Lemur Center to better understand how good of a climber this animal was and what kind of posture it had. And as far as we can tell, it's an animal that really liked to jump from tree to tree, a little bit like a shafak, which is a type of lemur that we have here at the Lemur Center. And so going back to the presentation, so now we've gotten into the origins of lemurs. The question becomes, how do we get to true lemurs? Because Smilodectes does not have a tooth comb, and it doesn't have a grooming claw. So we're not quite to true lemurs yet. So now we need to go a little bit further along, try to figure out where they came from. Now the story of lemurs ends up going from the northern continents eventually into the equatorial parts of the world. They cross from Eurasia into Africa. Africa at the time is an island continent, which means it's cut off from all the other continents by water. And so in order for lemurs and their relatives to get from the northern continent into Africa, they have to cross a body of water. And they are not terribly good swimmers. There was like, a lot of water that had to be swum across, basically the Mediterranean Sea, or like the beginning of the Mediterranean, that had to be crossed to get from Eurasia to Africa and eventually down to Madagascar. And the way that we think primates cross water is by observing what happens in natural settings. Primates like to live in really dense forest, and they especially like to live in mangroves. Mangroves are a special type of forest system that develops kind of along river systems near the mouth of open salty seaways. And so mangrove swamps are today home to lots of different species of primates. And we think that these mangrove swamps were something that would have developed along the coastlines of places like southern Europe and northern Africa. These mangroves are a great place for a primate to live until there's a storm. A storm, especially a big hurricane, typhoon, or cyclone, can cause a storm surge. Storm surge is basically when it pushes like giant waves up underneath these forests, and they can actually break off pieces of the forest because they don't have land underneath them. They're basically like a root system that's just growing into the water. They break off and become basically natural rafts. Those natural rafts can bring primates along with them, and they basically drift out to sea. And so a kind of maritime lemur relative got on a raft from Eurasia down to Africa. And fortunately, there was a population of them, or at least a pregnant female, that gave rise to all the lemurs that had to populate populate Africa. So then they could do it all again. They could live on mangroves off the coast of East Africa and eventually make their way to Madagascar. And so we have lemurs kind of through different time periods, and their relatives crossing using this natural event that today is observed by people out at sea. Will find these natural rafts with animals possibly living on them. And given enough time, it seems like eventually primates cross some really massive bodies of water. And we're really fortunate that lemurs made that journey and the relatives of monkeys and apes, because eventually lemurs and their relatives go extinct in the northern continents and are only left as this remnant population in Africa. That extinction happens about 35 million years ago. And if they hadn't found the right raft to get across the ocean, we wouldn't be here today giving this presentation, and we wouldn't have lemurs to celebrate for World Lemur Day. Now, to understand how lemurs diversified once they got to Africa, we then have to find rocks in Africa. And fortunately, there's an amazing site in a place called the Fayum Depression of Egypt, which is part of the western desert of Egypt. Today, it's a very dry and dusty place, but in the past, it was one of these kind of coastal mangrove swamp-like places. So these animals that would have rafted across would have found a very cozy habitat when they got across the ocean. One of the amazing things is also, because you're in Egypt, archaeology and paleontology are happening right next to each other, because there's temples, and then underneath this temple is actually fossils of ancient crocodiles and even ancient primates. If we go back in time, instead of a dusty kind of desert setting, we would find something that looked more like this, which would have had elephants, it would have had primates, it would have had manatees, and all these animals living alongside each other. And it's also where we find some of the evidence of the earliest monkey-like primates. And so one of the differences between the lemur line and the monkey line is that the monkey line, or anthropoids, have a closing behind their eyeball that basically creates an eye socket. And the presence of an eye socket is something that makes a monkey and an ape. Lemurs don't have that. They have basically just an opening behind the back of their eye. And so in the rocks of the Fayum, we find animals that have just the bar without a closing behind their eyeball. And we have animals that have eye sockets that tell us the relatives of lemurs are living alongside the relatives of our earliest monkey-like ancestors. One of the animals that we find in the rocks of the Fayum is the oldest eye that's ever been discovered. An eye is one of the craziest lemurs that exists. It's actually, I think, one of the weirdest mammals that exists. And I know that it's one of Megan's favorite animals. The eye is basically a animal that has a primate that's trying to become a little bit like a woodpecker. They have these really long front teeth that they use to kind of burrow into things to look for more food, usually looking for bugs. In the Fayum, we find the jaw of an animal called Plesiopithecus. Plesiopithecus has this long burrowing tooth on it. It also has teeth that look a lot like a modern eye. And so there's this discovery that was made only a couple of years ago that in the Fayum, we have evidence of like one of the lemur groups is actually present in Africa about 35 million years ago. We then have evidence of a eye-like animal living in Kenya in Eastern Africa about 20 million years ago. And then finally, we have the eye that is living in modern Madagascar. So what that tells us is that the relatives of eyes were living in Africa. They diversified there. They got this crazy kind of tooth burrowing thing going on. And then they crossed to the island of Madagascar at some point between about 34 million years ago and today. And we think that happened probably around 20 million years ago. The reason we think that is because other animals make this journey. It's not just primates that are kind of getting stuck on these natural rafts and going out to sea. Other animals, things like tenrecs, which is this weird kind of like hedgehog-like animal at the top, fusas, which are the carnivores of Madagascar, a group of rodents that arrive in Madagascar, native to Madagascar, and then primates as lemurs arrive. And all of those animals we think arrived between 40 and 20 million years ago. And so that brings our story to lemurs finally getting to the island of Madagascar. Now the problem is we can't find those early colonizing lemurs in Madagascar because the fossil record of Madagascar is not like the fossil record of the American West. There weren't mountains being built at this really convenient time when lemurs were coming over. So we're not getting new rock being developed, getting built up, eroded, and then a place where we can find fossils. Instead, most of the fossil hunting that we do in Madagascar takes place in caves. And so all of these red dots represent places where we find fossils in Madagascar in caves around the island. And so what that means is caves are really fragile structures. They collapse really quickly and easily. And so they're only temporary windows into time. So if you find an open cave, it means it hasn't been open, geologically speaking, for very long. That means that the fossil record of Madagascar is very young. Most of the fossils we have of lemurs from Madagascar are only between about 20,000, and then most of them are only like 12,000 years and younger. And that may seem like a long time ago. It was. Like 12,000 is a lot of time. But in the grand scheme of primate evolution, where we're going back 60 million years ago, this might as well be today. And what we find in the caves of Madagascar is not something that looks like today. Instead, what we find is an amazing diversity of lemurs that were huge. the extinct giant lemurs of Madagascar, some of which I have behind me right now. And so I am going to show you kind of what this picture would have looked like. This is an image of Madagascar only about 1,000 years ago, where you would have had giant gorilla-sized lemurs climbing through the trees alongside modern species. Things like chafox and ringtail lemurs would have been living in the exact same forest as these giant extinct lemurs were. You have pygmy hippos living in the water, so hippos that are about the size of a pig, along with giant birds. And so all of these animals are part of the ecosystem of Madagascar. And so I am going to stop sharing my screen again so I can introduce you to some of these creatures. And also let Megan chime in on some of the diversity of lemurs that we have today. So some of the animals that we have, behind me, this isn't a background, this is actually part of the exhibit that we have. This is an animal called Paleopropithecus. And so Paleopropithecus is also nicknamed the sloth lemur. And it comes by that name pretty honestly because its feet are basically claws, just like a sloth has. The way that we know that it's not a sloth and it's a lemur is, again, it has this curve of bone behind its eyeball that tells us we're dealing with a primate. And when we look inside of its mouth, it has a tooth comb. In this display, we have it alongside the skeletons of modern lemurs. So this is a ruffed lemur, which is that kind of bearded lemur that we compared to the squirrel. And this is something we actually find in the fossil record. In the cave where we found the sloth lemur remains that are hung up right here, we also find the skull and bones of modern species of ruffed lemur, because that's basically what we're dealing with. Is like the modern Malagasy landscape is missing these very recently extinct giant lemurs. Also living alongside the sloth lemur is this animal called Megalatopus. Megalatopus basically means the giant lemur, Megalatopus. And this is the skull of Megalatopus. This is a gorilla-sized lemur that only went extinct, we think, in the last couple of centuries. There are people building castles in Europe, and there are people who are just going about their lives in a world where there is a giant lemur living in Madagascar that would have been the size of a gorilla. Alongside them is this creature called Archaeolemur. Archaeolemur is often nicknamed the monkey lemur because it has a huge brain compared to its body size. And it also has big flat teeth that would have made it a really, really good omnivore. Monkeys today are really good at eating all kinds of food. And that's something we think Archaeolemur would have been able to eat as well. So ultimately, these animals go extinct. And in a lot of ways, the story of these animals is wrapped up in the story of modern lemurs. Lemurs are a highly endangered group of animals. And their extinction has basically worked from the big animals to some of the most endangered lemurs that are alive today is a group of animals called Indri that are the largest lemurs that are alive today. And that is the product, we think, of habitat change, climate change, and ultimately people needing to use the landscape that also could be used by lemurs. And so we can talk a little bit more about the extinction pressures facing modern lemurs that has affected some of these extinct animals. But with that, I'm going to step away from my microphone so that Megan can chime in and we can answer some questions about some of these creatures.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Here, but I'm not able to turn my video back on for some reason. Sorry, everybody.
Oh, no.
One moment, everyone.
Oof. There we go. Okay.
There.
I got the button.
All right.
There we
back.
go. Perfect.
I didn't know there were giant lemurs.
Nope, me neither.
am a little sad. They went extinct fairly recently, so I'm a little sad that we couldn't see them.
Yeah, like I said, it's wild. Like, I don't know, it's so close. And there's actually one of the crazy things about Paleopropithecus is there's folklore, we think, about this animal. There's a monster in Malagasy folklore that has like what it's described as the face of a human, but the fur of a dog, that has really long, creepy hands and long claws. And it's kind of a boogeyman that lives in the forest. And it's called the which is, it's spelled T-R-E-T-R-E-T-R-E, and it makes like a ch sound. It's like ch-ch-ch is what they would have called it. And the hypothesis is that there's a lot of lemurs whose names are basically imitations of the sound that they make. And so the shafak, which is the animal is a sound that Paleopropithecus would have made. And so we have this like folkloric memory of the sound, just like paleo sound of a giant lemur, which is amazing.
That's so cool.
Now, Megan, you work with the live lemurs, you said, right? What is that like?
So I'm going to be honest, my job is more working with the live humans who come to see the lemurs, but also there are live lemurs around, different primates. But it's pretty amazing. To be honest, though, my favorite part about working here at the Lemur Center, of course, the live lemurs are wonderful, but I've worked in other zoological settings with live animals, and the thing that stands out here is that, like, we are literally up to date with, you know, like the latest paleontology research, the latest in like the live research that's going on. During our tours, there will be an actual research trial happening that we'll stop and talk about, or we'll have, you know, questions about our conservation, and I can literally go next door to the office of the person running that program. So having all that information and all those programs like right at your fingertips is actually my favorite part. Although lemurs are pretty cute and pretty great, I won't lie about that.
And then, so, you know, can you tell us a little bit about like what it is that you can learn from studying the live lemurs in comparison with the fossil lemurs that, you know, is really helpful for your audiences?
Sure. So we kind of generalize it into two main categories for why we study lemurs and why it's important, at least for the live lemurs. And the first, Matt's already talked about pretty extensively. They're a really early branch of the primate family tree. We're looking at, you know, I call it kind of the like, without Madagascar, you don't get that what if of like, what if strepsirrhines get to take over an island and basically become the finches to, you know, Madagascar? They can spread everywhere. Without Madagascar, you don't get those questions answered, which is really cool. It's also a link to, obviously, early in our own evolutionary tree. So we currently have studies going on with dwarf lemurs. Dwarf lemurs are a whole group of species of primate that are the only group of primates, and there's a skeleton there, that are, they're so small, they're about the size of a squirrel. And they're the only group of primates we know of living currently that truly hibernate. They'll hibernate for 6 months out of the year. And they really are going into that extreme state of metabolic depression successfully. For a tiny animal, dwarf lemurs can live into their 20s, late 20s, close to 30, which is really, really long. So there are implications for long life and longevity and their cellular growth and how they've evolved to use that hibernation. There's implications for humans in the future. We share a lot of genetic coding with dwarf lemurs as primates. Could we learn something about our own future in space travel or medical care by learning from this primate that successfully hibernates? So there's that connection to us. And then on the other side, there's also the fact that Matt's touched on that lemurs are incredibly endangered. So at this point, 95% of lemur species are considered endangered or critically endangered, and there are 108, if you're a splitter, there are 108 recognized species of lemur living today in Madagascar, and they represent 20% of the world's primate species. So even though they live on only one island, they're really critically endangered, but they're also representing a huge portion of primate diversity still living in the world. So it's obviously very important to study them. So we study everything from their behavior to their hormone levels to their diet. Lots of fecal studies go on here. Really simple, non-invasive way to study animals is to look at what's in their poop. One of our other researchers here is applying things learned here to the wild. If she can take fecal samples and look at pulling out the DNA of the plants that lemur is eating and learn what plants they're eating from the fecal samples, that makes wild studies infinitely more possible and feasible because you don't have to study the lemur all day, every day to know what they're eating.
Yeah, and just to follow up on the extinction thing real quick, is I should mention, so 17 species of lemur have gone extinct. And one of the things that we know from modern lemur studies is when you look at the genetic history of these animals, we, like Megan said, we are, if you're a splitter, you have 108 different species. And that means that you kind of are looking at really small genetic differences between some of these things. But there's also like some pretty big physical differences between some of these. There's lots of different species of shafak that are basically differentiated by what their fur looks like, where they live, and how they behave. But when you look at the skeleton of a shafak, a silky shafak or a cockerel shafak don't really look all that different. And so one of the things looking at the fossil record is we know it's definitely an underestimate of the number of species that have been lost, because there may have been multiple species of Paleocropithecus that, they had different colors, they had different calls, or lived in different parts of the island. And we really, until better genomic possibilities open up, we can't really tease apart really how much was lost. So we know we're underestimating how much of an impact the island has already had as far as species loss.
I don't remember. I was really fascinated by all the information you were giving, but do we know one of the big reasons why so many of these species have gone extinct recently on Madagascar?
So, Matt, do you want to take this one?
I can follow up on you. How about you lead?
Sure. So, I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons is related to human activity. And I think that's in two parts: human activity directly on the island, and we're looking at an island that's mostly in the tropics. So climate change has a huge impact on that island as well. It's important to remember when we talk about human activity that we're talking about activity that's built over thousands of years. There's a lot of debate exactly when humans arrived. It was sometime between like 2,500 and 10,000 years ago, depending on which study you're looking at and which evidence they're holding to. And most of the people living on modern day Madagascar are living on, a couple of dollars a day. They're doing very simple farming to feed their families, maybe have enough to feed the villages around them. And so you're looking at people who are not directly making a decision to disregard the environment. These are people who are just living very simply on an island with a huge population and not a lot of resources available to them. But just like in the States, we work with Malagasy people who are very passionate about conservation. We work with Malagasy scientists and teams of people, even local villagers and farmers who've really gotten invested in our sustainable farming practices that we've introduced them to with other organizations. So it's important to remember that it's very complicated when we talk about human involvement in causing conservation issues. And there's a lot more you can learn by checking out our conservation stuff on our website as well. But I'm happy to go into it more if there's questions.
We'll be sure to put that in the description. Britt, do we have any questions from the audience right now?
Absolutely, we do. Some of them have already been answered in the chat by some of your colleagues at Duke Lemur Center. There was a lot of other staff members in the chat, so it was great to talk to them. But I am going to ask them to you guys as well, just so that people listening who may not be looking at the chat will also get the same information. And one of the question was, at the Lemur Center, how much handling of the actual lemurs is there? Is it a very hands-off kind of practice, or how does that work at a center where you have living animals in addition to fossil remains?
Yeah, and I think it's especially important to talk about this when we have an image like this behind me, where there's this cute fuzzy looking animal, adorable. And it's very tempting to think, oh, adorable, I should pet it. As humans, we tend to care about things that we like, and we tend to like things that are very fuzzy and cuddly looking. But it's important to remember domesticated and wild is an evolutionary process. That is not something you can do with a single individual animal. And so here at the Lemur Center, these are wild animals. Any handling that is done is part of an animal care or veterinary need. So it can be done through voluntary training. We have an awesome positive reinforcement training program where lemurs build up trust with their trainer, one of their keepers, and they will allow things as advanced as voluntarily letting us remove a baby to weigh them and then put them back on. Not every lemur mom is kosher with that, though. Some lemur moms say no, and we treat those babies as hands-off. So it's very much a decision that the lemur kind of is involved in. We look at their behavior, we look at their reactions. We don't want to get injured any more than they want to be handled when they don't want to. It's important to remember that cute mouth is full of teeth that can crunch right through the outer shells of the hardest nuts you know. So there's self-defense involved too. And then, of course, if we need to bring them in for veterinary care or something along those lines, our staff are trained in how to safely do that, how to safely anesthetize the animals. But we aren't able to just go out and, snuggle a lemur or pick them right up. The easiest way to remember that that's a bad idea is, especially with prey animals like lemurs, if anything's grabbing them in the wild that they weren't expecting, it's probably trying to eat them. So if you try to grab them, they're going to act accordingly. So let's just avoid everyone getting injured.
Fair. I would say that's fair.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think we've got some other questions here. Was the diet of the giant lemurs that Matt showed us, was that any different from smaller lemurs?
So the working hypothesis, actually, it's kind of amazing. There was a recent study that was actually able to get genomic data out of a subfossil lemur jaw of a megalatopus. So that's basically like getting ancient DNA. So it's like Jurassic Park kind of stuff. It's not millions of years old, but it's extinct, which is amazing. And one of the things that they were able to confirm, which is also something we can see when we actually look at the teeth of these animals, is these creatures love to eat leaves. And they are like fully committed to eating leaves, even in a way that no modern lemur is as fully committed to eating leaves as these things would have been, which makes some sense for being really big animals. One of the things is like if to get big, you need to constantly be eating and getting calories. And so you don't want to rely on fruit, which kind of pops up here and then pops up here. They probably could have eaten fruit and would have eaten fruit if it was in front of them. But they seem to be much more committed to eating leaves. And there's actually in their genetic sequence, a sequence that codes for basically breaking down leaf products. So what we can look at in the teeth and observe from comparing them to other animals that eat leaves, we now have genetic evidence that that's definitely what they were doing. Same thing with Paleopropithecus, is that this is probably a leaf-eating animal. And the shafak, as you can see in the picture behind Megan, is also a leaf eater. But one of the pieces of evidence that's been gathered basically by observing these animals at the Lemur Center and in the wild is they're not only leaf eaters. Like they're kind of, they mix up the kinds of plants that they eat a little bit more than these animals probably would have.
Huh.
So
That's cool.
speaking of that, oh, go ahead, Brittany.
Oh, no, I was just going to express how cool it is, in working with fossils myself, it's like, oh, well, we can do maybe some isotope data to figure out what things ate, or you look at the teeth. It is so cool that you can look at all these different angles. Now you can look at the teeth, you can look at the genomic data, and you can look at living relatives and be like, okay, we have a pretty good idea of what this giant lemur would have eaten thousands of years ago.
Blew my mind.
A little jealous, honestly. You're just replete with data.
Well, speaking of these are creatures that evolved and adapted in Madagascar to very specific vegetation. How do you go from getting lemurs that live in Madagascar? How do you work it so that they can live and survive in Durham, North Carolina? How does that process go?
Good question.
Absolutely. It's a great question, and it's applicable, right, to any population of any animal we have in human care. A lot of them are pretty far from home, We have tigers living in zoos in North America that are really far from their natural habitat. So for all those animals, it's years and years of research, and I will say in general, both across zoos, we're part of the AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums here in the U.S., and for research centers all over, it's been a lot of learning over the years. The Lemur Center has been here since 1966. So we have the benefit of being one of the institutions doing that research and learning along the way. And there's actually evidence in our old documents that we almost didn't have cockerel shafak in human care. They're really delicate. They're really difficult to maintain carefully. We're really careful about where we send them. It's hard to find other institutions to house them because they're a fascinating, wonderful, charismatic animal. But as soon as the veterinary team and the zoological team get all of the requirements we have for what their housing looks like, what their diet needs to look like, what their veterinary care is going to look like, how meticulous you have to be with all those things, most of those places back off and say, you know what, that's not a good fit for us, which is good on one hand because we know that it's not a good fit. Bad on the other hand, because we want as many of these animals in our human population, human cared for population, in order to have diverse genetics long term. So a lot of that came from just learning over the years, and it especially became easier for us once we developed our natural habitat enclosures that Matt mentioned. So these big chunks of acres of forest where the lemurs can free roam, like the lemur in the photo behind me is doing. And also once we were able to connect back what the researchers we've worked with over many decades and the staff researchers here have been learning in the wild and here back into their care. So it kind of forms this wonderful feedback loop, and it includes the fossil collection even. We're looking at, Matt can use what the current lemurs are doing in our population to inform what the lemurs he's finding in bones, in the fossils might be doing. And on the flip side, I know Matt, you can probably give more on this example. There's evidence of, certain lemurs that we thought were really, really specific in their diet. And then you found fossil evidence for them elsewhere in the island that shows, no, actually they were able to adapt. And so, yeah, bamboo lemur, there we go, the crystal skull. And so that feedback loop is basically how we've just improved that care over time. I will say there's certain exceptions. Right now, were not open for our general tours because of a combination of winter weather and COVID, which is a risk for the lemurs that we have not had any of the lemurs show symptoms or test positive or anything, but we're being extra cautious. And the lemurs have all had to move into kind of indoor hybrid habitats because they're not adapted to this really cold weather that we get sometimes in North Carolina. During the summer, the lemurs do pretty well. It's pretty similar overall. And some lemurs might even fare a little easier. Ring-tailed lemurs are from an area called the Spiny Desert, which is about as nice to live in as it sounds for a lemur. So living here in North Carolina is a little bit easier for some of the lemurs, especially with, a perfect diet being brought out every day, full-time veterinary care, fences to make sure no predators are coming in after them. So most of them actually live quite a bit longer than their wild relatives do.
It's like a spa for them, huh? Kind of.
Yeah, pretty much. And especially since our research is non-invasive, they've got it pretty easy here for the most part.
Yeah,
very
and
nice.
one of the things to kind of follow up on with that real quick is with like I brought up the crystal skull just because it's my favorite specimen in our collection, but also because this is an animal. This is called the greater bamboo lemur. So there's a species that's still alive, but this skull was discovered in the northernmost tip of Madagascar. And today, this species is only found in like one tiny little pocket in like the southeastern part of Madagascar. And so with only the modern record, you would think that the greater bamboo lemur was something that only lived in like this one specific kind of forest with this one specific kind of bamboo. And like, if we're trying to rehabilitate species, like it's a bad investment because it's pretty much on its way out. The fossil record of Madagascar reveals that this is an animal that clearly could live in many other places. It's just gone locally extinct in some of those places. So when we think about what both the preferred habitat and diet of these animals are, we need to look at the fossil record to really put that all together. And even looking at modern animals, like this is what the forest of Madagascar is supposed to look like. It should have sloth lemurs that are eating all kinds of leaves. They're probably eating seeds, moving those seeds around as they climb through the forest and the kind of poop seeds out with their fertilizer. And that creates new forest for these animals. And so today, lemurs are living in a world that's missing a whole bunch of animals. And so even understanding kind of the preferred diets and habitats of modern animals isn't entirely answered by looking at wild populations because they've been affected by these extinctions. And in captivity, we have a little more control over how much the animals can, like how protected they are. And maybe we might see some behaviors emerge that we don't see in the wild because they're living in a different kind of habitat. They're not as stressed as they are in the wild. So there's this kind of feedback and conversation to be had between captive populations and wild populations with a lot of lemurs in captivity, and both in Madagascar and in other parts of the world.
Wow, that synergy between the living and fossil collections is just so cool to see. That is such an interesting use of fossils. Okay, I've got a question for both of you. This will probably be our last question. What is your favorite lemur species? And I will say that it could be living, extant, or extinct. I know. We bring the hard-hitting questions here at Fossil Friday.
My answer is very, very easy. I'll go first. So I literally have an eye skull tattooed on my arm. So
yes.
And I also was, this is a theme in my life. I was recently on Science Friday defending the eye. So they are just amazing. I'm particularly fond of kind of the weirdos of the animal world. So the stranger you get, the more I like them. So obviously I gravitate towards eyes. They're the largest nocturnal primate. We talked earlier about lemurs having nails and not claws, but not if you're an eye. They break a lot of rules. They have claws instead of fingernails. They have beaver teeth instead of the typical adaptations. They have way bigger brains compared to other lemurs. They're just pretty remarkable. And in my opinion, they're super adorable. And if folks disagree, I'm glad I can't see the chat right now because I don't want to hear it.
That's okay. I'm on the II defense squad too. They're just so cool.
They're amazing. Yeah, my answer is that. I mean, like that's the right answer. No offense to anyone who thinks it's another answer. But for the sake of championing the fossil record, my other favorite of the extinct animals probably is Megalodopus. Because one of the things I love about the fossil record is it reveals things that we wouldn't make up even if we could. That like there's no reason looking at modern lemurs that you would think there'd be a gorilla-sized lemur. Like to look at modern lemurs, it's like, well, they get about the size of a cat. Like there's some small ones, but but this animal demonstrates that lemurs as a group basically like are the full range of diversity in primates. Like the smallest primate alive today is the mouse lemur, which earns its name. It's even smaller than the dwarf lemur. And then the largest primate that's alive today is a gorilla. And then this is a gorilla-sized lemur. So it's basically like what it means to be a primate is like wrapped up in what it means to be a lemur. And without the fossil evidence of Megalatopus, we wouldn't kind of have that perspective on just how diverse like this basic lemur body plan is. Because like, I don't know if you find them in the fossil record, like most of them went extinct millions and millions of years ago. So it's like monkeys and apes must be better. But instead, they happen to get to Madagascar and they do all of the cool things that monkeys and apes are able to do, including the variation in diet, all the variation in body size, different ways of moving through the trees. Like it's all there in Megalatopus is kind of like evidence that we have to look for these things. Like there's a reason to look in the fossil record to be astounded by what biology can do.
Don't mind me. I'm going to go Google mouse lemur.
Oh, and again, lumpers versus splitters, you're looking for a lot of different species there. But the tiniest one he's talking about is Madame Bertha's mouse lemur, which is about 2 inches long. So.
Oh, it's so cute and tiny.
Oh my god.
All right, I'm looking for that later.
Yes. Yeah. Alrighty.
So,
their little fingernails are the craziest part to me.
Oh, okay, hold on.
Tiny hands freak me out.
I'm just going to look at this really, really quick. Okay?
Yeah, hold on.
And then don't neglect the other end of the extant collection, the Indri, which everyone should look up after this. They have a beautiful kind of whale-like song. They're huge. They're featured heavily in Malagasy folklore as kind of ancestral, related to humans, and very revered. And they're pretty remarkable. And you'll only see them if you go to Madagascar, just like most other species of lemur.
Well, I'm not getting other work done today because I'm just going to be looking at all these types of lemurs. Thank you all so much.
Yes.
Well, usually we end our show with one question for both of you. What's one piece of advice you'd like to give for people who be interested in following a career in paleontology, or for you, Megan, a career in education?
Sure, I'll go first again. I would say keep your options open and don't limit yourself. I was totally career track. I was studying international studies and psychology, doing all these other things, and then a random volunteering opportunity where I was scooping tiger poop and scrubbing waters completely derailed my plans for my career. I don't have the traditional formal education that everyone else here does, but that's okay. You can find a center with people like Matt, who has the formal education, can give you the synthesized version of everything, and then you can just blab about it to people. So whether it's, the artistic talents that Carrie has shown through her work as a fossil reparator and creating all these displays, or really being good at babbling about animals. My nickname as a kid from one of my dear friends was the Encyclopedia of Useless Animal Information. So whatever those things are. And she was just here visiting me the other day, learning about lemurs for me. It was great. So whatever your interests are, hold on to them and don't assume what you do has to look a certain way to be involved. There's all kinds of ways to be involved in this. There's science with a capital S. There's citizen science. You can volunteer. You can do it as your job. Just hold on to those interests and don't limit yourself is my advice.
Basically the same thing for being a paleontologist. Like the reason I became a paleontologist was in some ways because I couldn't make a decision about what kind of scientist I wanted to be. Like I took geology. Like the reason I kind of declared that was like, well, I got to take chemistry and physics and biology in order to major in geology because it's this very synthetic science. And it's like, well, at least my counselor get off my back for like not declaring anything yet. And so I'll just declare being a geologist because they won't commit. And then anthropology was, I was interested in history and folklore and languages and fossils, and all of those are basically anthropology. So my majors were kind of like cop-outs because it was like I don't know exactly what I want to do. But then through that, like through having diverse interests, I eventually found kind of like what really I wanted to focus on. And in some ways, like being an academic paleontologist, someone who goes and gets a PhD, it can be really frustrating to go from having like paleontology, it's all about like continents smashing into each other and climate change and diseases spreading and like all this stuff that like I want to know all of it. But then you end up kind of focusing and learning one little thing and then contributing to science in a broader way. And I guess that's kind of advice in anyone thinking about becoming like a scientist, where that focusing eventually does happen and specialization, because like you basically need to become an expert on something so that you're useful in a team of other scientists who have expertise in something else. And you want to contribute to that larger team effort. Like science is not something one person can do by knowing everything. It's something we do collaboratively by lots of people knowing lots of different things and being aware of what other people are doing next door. And so kind of being open to doing all kinds of stuff. But then like at a certain point, like recognizing it's time to focus, because once you do that, once you become the scientist, then you get to collaborate again and you can spread out again. And I kind of wish I'd known that spreading out and all this collaborative stuff that I get to do at the Lemur Center is like after I focused and was kind of frustrated by that, and then it branched out again. So if you're in the tunnel or thinking about going into like a specialty and it feels too focused, there are opportunities. Like life doesn't end after you're done with your major. You keep going on, meeting new people and working in new places, and you get to spread out again.
Or you can be like me and skip the schooling and just steal all the information from people like Matt and spit it back out.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really, really fun World Lemur Day. Thank you both so much for joining us and teaching us all about lemurs. And Brady and I are going to be spending the rest of the day on Wikipedia, looking up all these really cool lemurs, or actually looking up photos on your social media, right? At Duke Lemur Center.
It's a very
We're
good
on
follow.
Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We've had a whole bunch of stuff going on for World Lemur Day. We had a great presentation live from Madagascar this morning, so check us out to find all those things.
Sweet. That's what definitely we'll be doing. Do you have any more events or anything coming up like that you want to share with us?
Actually, I think this closes out our day, but if anyone missed anything earlier in the day, everything's recorded and available, so you can go back and see everything. And we've got so much on our website, and there's so much we didn't even touch on today, so welcome to the rabbit hole that is the Lemur Center. Enjoy.
Awesome. Can't wait to visit in person.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much, and thank you to all of our audience for joining us today. As always, if you like this program and want to support programs like it at the Alf Museum and the Western Science Center, you can find links on how to do that in the description below. And as always, make sure you like and subscribe for more stories from the world of paleontology. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.